This is a collaboration today between the Office of Clinical Research and CCTST. My partner in crime here, Stephanie Shookman. She and I got this together and are more than delighted to bring you today's presentation. All right, so she worked here at UC. She does have a connection to UC. She is now the chair of sociology and criminology at Howard University. And I'm going to pass the floor off to Dr. Norwood. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Yeah, I've been ready. Hello, everyone. Hello from Howard University. It's an honor, a real true honor to be with you all today to start Black History Month and to share with you some work I've been doing in Cincinnati these last 10 years. So as I mentioned, I was at UC for 16 years. I did most of my academic career at UC. I only left in 2021, but I still very much feel still there, with certainly a foot and a half still in a city as I continue to finalize this work. Before I start the talk specifically on Black doctors in Cincinnati, I want to give you a little bit of background of what led me up to this work. Slide 2. Okay, so I got a grant from the University of California, San Francisco, AIDS prevention studies to carry out an exploratory study on HIV in the Black community. My study was inspired by this newspaper article published in the Black-owned Cincinnati Herald newspaper. So the newspaper identified specific neighborhoods where new HIV infections were concentrated, but made no mention of Black women who too face the highest risk of becoming newly infected among women. With this in mind, I became interested in understanding how race, gender, and space intersects in the production of health disparities. To really understand what was happening in the present, I needed to understand how we got here. So specifically with regards to neighborhood health disparities and the creation of what Yale sociologist Eli Anderson calls Black space. Slide 3. How and why were Black spaces constructed in Cincinnati? How did Black space function, and what were the manifest consequences of residing in Black spaces? After doing some digging into the history of Cincinnati, I called what Eli Anderson termed Black space Jim Crow geographies. I used Jim Crow geographies to highlight the intentionality of and deliberate use of policy in constructing Black space. That's what makes it structural, right? My book, now under contract with Columbia University Press, entitled Jim Crow Geographies, Mapping the Intersections of Poverty, Gender, Race, and Sexuality in Urban Space, is the culmination of this work. Slide 4. Towards the end of my time at the archives, I happened to see a news report while living in Cincinnati that featured Marjorie Parham, who, as you may know, recently passed away in 2021 at the age of 103. Ms. Parham was the widow of Gerald L. Porter, the founder of the Cincinnati Herald newspaper. I'm going to play this 2-minute clip and then we'll continue to talk.
Of Black History Month. 9 on Your Side is sharing the stories of African-American history makers in the tri-state.
Kristen Swilley introduces us to pioneers in the press for a series we call Black History Month Then and Now.
Newsrooms, they are places of varying ideas, techniques, and mediums. But for a long time, many of them were missing something very important: diversity. And that means African Americans, including those in Cincinnati, started putting their own stories on paper, often in the face of fierce opposition.
It was a one-man staff, really, for the most part in its early days.
99-year-old Marjorie Parham will tell you her late husband, Gerald Porter's first love was his newspaper.
It's given African Americans a voice.
And when it debuted in 1955, the Cincinnati Herald spoke loudly, celebrating the joy of weddings, lamenting the loss of life.
Things that might have been smoothed over or overlooked or underreported.
It is the kind of defiance the publisher of The Union, another black newspaper in Cincinnati, embodied decades earlier.
If you were compiling a list of the most influential people in Cincinnati history, Wendell Phillips Dabney's name would definitely be on that list.
Writer, editor, salesman, Dabney was the paper, and the paper was Dabney, meaning he'd protect it at all costs, even keeping a revolver on his desk and defying death threats.
He published in the paper his schedule, like here's when I leave my house, here's the route I walk, here's when I arrive at the office. Basically, Dabney was saying, if you want to get me, here I am.
Dabney worked on The Union until the year he died. Porter passed, filing one last story for the Herald.
He had been out photographing some kind, taking pictures of some sort of an affair.
Parham says the Cincinnati Herald publisher fell asleep while driving away, hit a guardrail, and was taken to an area hospital.
My husband had been up in X-ray, but they were bringing him down, and but if he needed further care, I'd have to move him because they didn't accept Negro bed patients.
Sometimes I flip through here.
But today, Porter's legacy lives on in this Avondale office.
People have to be vigilant. We have to keep fighting, have to keep advocating.
Here, the counsel and friendship of Parham, who briefly took over the Herald after Porter died, is valued by current publisher Jan Michelle Lemon-Kearney.
She's been really good about helping us stay on course.
And while a lot has changed, the staff is still speaking up with the hope everyone can be heard.
So many people have a lot to say, and we have to work together.
Kristen Swilley, 9 on your side.
It is okay to be so stressed.
Next slide. So in 1963, Gerald Porter was in a car accident, was taken to a hospital, Our Lady of Mercy Hospital in Marymount, which refused to treat him because he was Black, as stated to Marjorie Parham by one of the nurses. Next slide. Mr. Porter was then transported to another hospital, St. Mary's Hospital. By the time he reached that second hospital, as you've heard, it was too late and he passed away. Next slide. In the same year, 1963, the Supreme Court upheld the United States Court of Appeal Fourth Circuit decision in the Smickens versus Moses H. Cone that separate but equal racial segregation in federally funded hospitals violated constitutional guarantee of equal protection. The case was brought on by George Simpkins, an African-American dentist and NAACP leader of Greensboro, North Carolina, who had referred his patient for care at a local hospital, Cone Memorial and Long Hospital, but neither accepted Black patients. But because both hospitals had received millions of dollars in Hill-Burton funding, they had an obligation to guarantee equal protection under the Constitution. Slide 8. The Hill-Burton Act of 1946 sought to build and renovate new and renovate old hospitals across the nation. Hospitals benefiting from these funds had to commit to providing free or reduced care to those who could not afford it and build hospitals where they were needed. Another provision of Hill-Burton funding was a pledge not to discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, or creed, though separate facilities in the same locale, if equal, could remain. Like with segregation of schools, municipalities found it financially impossible to create and sustain separate and truly equal health care facilities in the same area. Next slide. Today's talk chronicles the history of Black medical professionals in Cincinnati and their navigation of the Jim Crow health infrastructure. However, before detailing some of the history of Cincinnati Black doctors, I'd like to provide a bit of social, historical, spatial context. I realize that this is a Cincinnati audience, but I can't take for granted a knowledge of the Cincinnati racial landscape. At Cincinnati's inception, free Blacks were already here. And though Ohio was established as a non-slave state, at its inception, developed the nation's Black laws. Black laws, if you don't know, were the precursor or blueprint of Jim Crow laws adopted in the post-slavery era in Southern and Northern states. And though free Blacks had always resided in Cincinnati, Blacks have never fully been welcomed in Cincinnati, and their belonging has always been situated at its margins. Next slide. 19th century Cincinnati is characterized by high racial tension with numerous white mob attacks on its Black citizens, one of which in 1829 led to a mass exodus of 1,000 to 2,000 Blacks to Wilberforce, Canada, which is how that area gets settled. Cincinnati was the home to both anti-slavery activists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, and had its own colonization society, the Cincinnati Colonization Society, which encouraged the out-migration of its free Black citizens to Liberia, Africa. Many prominent whites in Cincinnati, including Beecher's father, Lyman Beecher, the city's great doctor, Daniel Drake, and his protege, Dr. John Lambert Richard, were supporters of the Colonization Society. In 1850, Drake commented that we don't need an African population, quote unquote, whom he viewed as, quote, parasitic to the white man in propensity, end quote. Drake was not alone in his view. A free Black population was understood as a problem that could not coexist with whites as equal in space. So what was the impact of Ohio Black laws on Black Cincinnatians? Under Ohio Black laws, Blacks were deprived access to public school despite paying taxes. They could not testify in court against whites. They were excluded from being jurors. They were prohibited the use of poorhouses, could not own a firearm, could not serve in the state armed forces. And yet when the Civil War broke out, despite the latter, the Black Brigade of Cincinnati formed in 1862, becoming the first organized Black soldiers employed for military duty during the Civil War. And that's a nod or shout out to Dr. Dillard, who I hope is here, but I don't know if he is. If you want to know more about the Black Brigade, talk to Dr. Dillard. Slide 11. The first recorded mention of Black doctors in Cincinnati is in 1830s, and it's recorded in a journal by an English immigrant by the name of Emma Alderson. Emma makes mention of a Black doctor being chased out of town by a white mob in 1839. The book's editor, Donald Hewlin, also notes in 1850, the census record listing 2 Black doctors residing in Cincinnati, one of whom was a Dr. Jack Kett. In Otto Jutner's 1906 nearly exhaustive medical history of Cincinnati, there's only one mention of a colored hospital and colored physician. In a single sentence, he notes, an interesting institution is the Lincoln Memorial Hospital on Barr Street for colored patients and successfully conducted by a colored physician, Frank W. Johnson. Dr. Johnson was born in Ripley, Ohio in 1866. He attended the college at Erlin in Richmond, Indiana, and graduated in 1884. He entered Columbus Medical College in Columbus, Ohio, and graduated in 1867. He is the second colored man to receive a degree from this school. After graduating, he relocates to Chicago, where he practiced medicine before coming to Cincinnati. So Dr. Johnson was not the first colored physician, and his hospital was not the first colored hospital. According to William P. Dabney, in his book, Colored People in Cincinnati, Dr. Tate is Cincinnati's first colored doctor. Dr. Tate is noted as the first colored person to have graduated from Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati in either 1880 or 81. And that source comes from actually W.B. Du Bois, Negro Physique. He did this for years, collected histories and data across the US, Du Bois did. And so that's where that source comes from. He voluntarily leaves Cincinnati to fight the Yellow Plague in Memphis, Tennessee, but was unfortunately infected with the disease and died from it. According to W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Tate made a record for himself, this is a quote, such as to receive a medal from the city government and made a handsome purse, end quote, before succumbing to yellow plague. And though Dabney refers to Dr. Tate as Cincinnati's first colored doctor, he also mentions C.F. Buckner, whose name is missed on that slide. It just says C.F., so it should be C.F. Buckner, who is described as practicing medicine in Cincinnati in the 1870s until his death in 1907 at age 40. Dr. Buckner was a highly regarded medical man, quote, for his marvelous cures, end quote. As such, he was often cited and acknowledged by white doctor colleagues in Cincinnati. Now, in the same year of Jutner's book, Du Bois writes in The Health and Physique of the Negro in America that Cincinnati had at least two other colored hospitals, one of which was called Colored Hospital, and the other is Colley Hospital. The latter was likely owned and operated by Dr. E.D. Colley. In 1925, Dr. Colley is the president of the Cincinnati Medical Association and is credited for his work co-organizing Negro Health Week, which gets started in Cincinnati in 1922. Dr. Colley is also mentioned in a 1916 Lancet article for his controversial decision to treat narcotic addicts, to which he declared was the humane thing to do, since patients were unable to secure relief for themselves. The last mention of Colley Hospital that I could find was in Du Bois's Negro Yearbook of 1914 through 1915. So I don't have the exact dates of existence for Colley Hospital. All in all, I could find references to 4 colored hospitals in Cincinnati: Colored Hospital, Colley, Lincoln, and Peter Fawcett Hospital, named in honor of Peter Fawcett, who was a former slave of Thomas Jefferson, who moved to Cincinnati. He was a literate man. He moved to Cincinnati. He served as a captain in the Black Brigade, and he married a professional woman who did hair named was Sarah Fawcett, who successfully sued the Cincinnati Streetcar Company in 1852 for Black women's rights to ride streetcars. I always find this interesting, the kind of lawsuits that happened before slavery that were successful, and this was one example here in Cincinnati. So William P. Dabney notes that Peter Fawcett Hospital made quite a name during the years it was in existence. 1 or 2 of our doctors had private hospitals, but they lasted only a short time. So Vanessa Gamble wrote a book named Making a Place for Ourselves, the Black Hospital Movement, 1920 to 1945. And she describes 3 patterns of Black hospitals in the South, okay? The all-Black hospital was built exclusively for Black patients. The physicians and nurses in many of these hospitals were white, in which they were Black or biracial. The mixed race hospital were of 2 types. The predominant type segregated Black in separate wards, such as all Black wings and basements and attic wards. The other type was separate buildings to the main hospital, or separate buildings located on the hospital grounds. Generally, in mixed race hospitals, only white physicians and nurses were admitted to the professional staff. In rare cases, Black physicians continued to care for their hospitalized patients. However, there were limits to the Black wards. And all white hospitals, which predominated in the South, Blacks were refused admission in all but the most extreme emergency situations. Cincinnati has often been described as an up-South city, or as James H. Robinson wrote in 1919, Cincinnati is a northern city with a southern exposure. This is a quote. Cincinnati is a northern city with a southern exposure, a gateway between North and South, used alike by fugitive slaves and freedmen of yesterday and migrants of today in their quest for utopia. To the Negro, utopia is a place where a man is a man, seemingly a much sought but ever fleeting, if ever existing, land of nowhere, end quote. Between 1900 and 1950, the Cincinnati Black population expands multifold. At the turn of the century, the surge of Black immigration and housing shortage due to spatial limitations on where Blacks could live meant that most Blacks in Cincinnati was contained to certain specific space. They were mainly regulated to the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th wards. Families were forced to reside in 19th century dwellings, previously constructed as single-family homes with poor ventilation, no indoor sanitation, and forced to cohabitate with strangers under extremely crowded conditions at exorbitantly high costs. These terrible housing conditions, really unfit for human habitation, created an environment ripe for tuberculosis. In addition, the red light activities with saloons and nightlife were confined to these areas of town, which then made African Americans more susceptible and vulnerable to higher prevalence of sexually transmitted infections. Infant and maternal mortality rates were too excessively higher among African American women compared to white women. In 1913, Cincinnati experienced a devastating flood. Money was raised to address the aftermath of this disaster. Homes were destroyed, and a large swath of the city's population was displaced. To address this problem, the community's elite donated money and organized a campaign to raise funds to address the enormous need. So they created the Council of Social Agencies in 1913, renamed the Community Chest in 1919, and since 1950, this agency is called the United Way. The Community Chest umbrella civic organization brought together diverse groups who had previously been separated entities. They consisted of professional social workers, clergymen that included Protestant, Catholics, and Jewish leaders, educators, public-minded citizens who were interested in the social problems confronting Cincinnati. By 1920, the Community Chest included more than 30 welfare organizations addressing family welfare, health, housing, and childcare. In the first 6 months, they raised $45,000. By 1920, the Community Chest had more than 35,000 donors and had raised funds in excess of $1.9 million that year. These funds were distributed to different welfare groups. Among them was the Negro Civic Welfare Association. In 1917, the Cincinnati Community Chest extended its focus to addressing the Negro problem. They established the Negro Civic Welfare Association, which fell under the direction of a Yale-trained sociologist named James H. Robinson, who served as its executive secretary. Robinson was tasked with addressing the city's extreme health problems among its Black citizens. Though race science at the time charged that the overrepresentation of Blacks in health statistics was due to biological inferiority, Black social health and medical scientists knew better and correctly and knew definitively that these problems were directly due to bad housing stock and the emerging rigidity of residential segregation, which lobbied to keep the Black population contained to a few square miles in the most dilapidated parts of the city. Robinson was tasked to lead the city's first sociological study on Negro life in Cincinnati. Robinson concluded that the deplorable housing conditions were the chief factors aggravating good health outcomes for the Cincinnati Negro population. He writes, quote, "The worst features of housing conditions strikes at health, mortality, and stability, and the stability of a family life. To illustrate, in one section of the city, 54% of houses are without baths and 83% are fire traps. 1 out of 3 toilets is in bad state of repair, 1 out of 4 in filthy conditions, and 1 out of every 10 an old-fashioned type of outhouse standing in the most congested parts of the city. In this situation, a few dark, damp, and overcrowded rooms, it is clear why the death rate of the Negro in the city is practically twice that of white people." Slide 13, next. The study's findings promoted interest in Negro Health Week. The Negro Civic League began hosting Negro Health Week in 1922. This was something started by Booker T. Washington in 1915 that Cincinnati started uptaking in 1922. So the National Health Week was observed between 1915 and until 1951. Cincinnati, incidentally, won first prize on 2 occasions, once in 1924 and again in 1926. In that same year, W.B. Du Bois is the keynote speaker at the Sunday night, the Sunday night culmination of the week's long events. Slide 14. That was a good find, by the way, in the archives when I discovered Du Bois had come. Slide 14. All right, so Robinson findings also justified funding for a new Jim Crow hospital called Mercy Hospital and a neighborhood clinic called the Shoemaker and Health and Welfare Clinic. While the hospital, directed by Frank A. Hall, was short-lived, existing from 1922 to about 1927, the Shoemaker Clinic, on the other hand, endured more than 40 years, from 1926 to 1949. As described, next slide, as described in her 1926 Pittsburgh column, Vom Diet, African-American poet Alice Dunbar informs readers of this new Cincinnati achievement towards the advancement of health of its Negro citizens. Quote, "Cincinnati has opened a new health and welfare center. The building in which housed the gift of Mr. Michael M. Shoemaker in memory of her husband, whose name it bears. It is under the general sponsorship of the Negro Civic Welfare Association and is being financed by the Community Chest and Council of Social Agency. Next slide. Dunbar, okay, the clinic serves two needs, Dunbar writes. One for the people. For main floor is the clinic where regular sessions of medicine, medical, surgical, venereal disease, dental, and prenatal clinics will be held. Next slide. The other and no less important services is that of giving colored physicians the opportunity to which they are so deprived, skill in clinical work. So these Black doctors needed a clinic and a place to practice their profession, as well as a training grounds for new up and coming doctors. Next slide. The need for Black serving hospitals augmented in the 1930s. The Cincinnati Black community was split between supporting the erection of a new Jim Crow hospital versus maintaining their resolve to defeat the segregated circumstances of, separate but equal, right? So in 1929, the Cincinnati NAACP declared that it would not support new efforts to rebuild another Jim Crow hospital. However, the Cincinnati Medical Association supported this effort. Amos Carnegie of New York was invited to Cincinnati to survey the prospects for building a new Negro hospital. This is in 1935, this newspaper article. Cincinnati Archbishop John McNichols, stated in Cincinnati Enquirer that the Negro hospitalization was ongoing and most unsatisfactory problem. It was an ongoing and most unsatisfactory problem. We have a number of Negro doctors and Negro nurses in Cincinnati, but the Negro doctor in the city is not treated fairly. He should be allowed to take his own people in General Hospital. In spite of the NAACP and the National Medical Association opposition, Cincinnati's most prominent doctors agreed to move forward with erecting a new Jim Crow hospital. The Cincinnati Medical Association made plans to put on a fundraiser in the fall of 1939 at the Colored World Fair hosted in Cincinnati. The mayor, James Stewart, and the president of the CMA, Dr. Payne Lee and Dr. Clark, and the general chairman all attended. Next slide. And while the new Negro hospital in Cincinnati never materialized, likely due to the shifting attitudes and growing momentum in support of integration, Dr. Clark, Breedlove, Kane, Dennis, Dr. Brown and Walton, and pharmacist Dr. Russell build something called the Ideal Medical Building in Walnut Hills. The newspaper article reads, a new $210,000 medical center is being constructed at 2916 Gilbert Avenue in Walnut Hills, to be known as Ideal Medical Building. It was completed in August and contains 6,200 square feet of floor space and will be completely air conditioned. Next slide. The Shoemaker Clinic closes in 1949. It is absorbed by the Cincinnati Department of Health. There are no known tensions, according to Bleecker Marquette, around that absorption. The work of the Black doctors and their allies should not continue to exist in obscurity. Their fight for racial justice in Cincinnati must be known and retold. I thank you and I thank them for their advocacy. I thank you today for attending, and I thank them for their advocacy, courage, strength, and unwavering determination to weaken the structural racism that continues to govern Black people's lives in Cincinnati. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Norwood. Wow. There are many comments, and I'll allow people to unmute themselves and clap. I see some claps from the reactions as well. Yes, please put on your video, and if you'd like to share a thought or two with Dr. Norwood. But just a couple thoughts from the chat, Dr. Norwood, when you were talking about the Black Brigade, Kaylin Butcher mentioned, I don't know if you've been downtown recently in Cincinnati, but there's also a Black Brigade monument along Smale Park downtown. So it's a great, it's a great historical preview of what happened and why they are so important to the city.
Right, absolutely. So, you know, I have to tell you, I'm a sociologist, and yet I'm using the research methods, at least in this presentation, that historians normally use, which is archival work. And I can tell you the data I have, it's like mountains. And trying to figure out what to include and what to, you know, give a nod to without going into too much detail is a challenge, especially for someone who's not terribly familiar with or not, you know, formally trained in doing archival work. But I hope that we can have a little bit of a conversation. The whole story about that new Negro hospital effort that started in the late 1920s, and they kept at it through the 1930s, is detailed in newspaper articles. And I just thought it was really fascinating because it is at, you know, the end of this Black hospitalization period, which was, again, according to Gamble, but mostly between 1920 and 1940 was at the height of that movement. And here we are in Cincinnati, where this effort is really underway. And you have, you know, actors like Dabney and Barry, who are big members in the NAACP, who are firmly opposed to building a new Negro hospital. And then you have the Black doctors who are trying to serve the community's best interests and their patients, and are advocating for it, right? And so that tension I thought was interesting to people, I believe, otherwise were in good relationship with each other. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, this is your book is going to be an amazing account of history, but this has been so informational. Steve Sunderland just asked, can you discuss Rosenwald Foundation?
So yeah, I know a little bit about the Rosenwald, and this was, and actually because of Carnegie, that newspaper article. So yeah, the Rosenwald Fund provided support to build Negro schools across the South and Negro hospitals. And so one of, I believe in that article, there was a proposal, and if it's not that one, it's a different article, for, I think it was a penny a day to raise funds from all, you know, collect this kind of collective pot of money so that people could build institutions. It was just, you know, out of sheer deprivation, trying to make a way with very little resources, very little support for a community that is so badly treated, honestly. It's just, it's for me, it's mind blowing when we think about that there were these laws and policies that denied people the basic necessity, you know, housing, the ability to feed themselves, the ability to get care at a hospital. And that in Cincinnati, it would be, you know, all the way into 1963, which is why I included that, because I'm from South Louisiana. I know what it's like there. And people tend to think in this up South city of Cincinnati that this is something that happens down there. But the reality is that Jim Crow regulated Black people's lives irrespective of where they were in the US. Malcolm X famously quipped that the South was any place south of Canada. And it's, it's a reference to the ubiquity of structural racism in the US, irrespective of where you are. I saw
Yes.
Casey's hand.
Yes.
Hi, I don't want to take up space, but I just wanted to know, this ended, and then we have so many healthcare discrepancies in Black and brown communities. If this wouldn't have ended, would it have fixed that? Or like how, I guess what I'm trying to say is this information, how can we apply it to current healthcare workers to make them understand that like these implicit biases that we see weren't that long ago. It was within our generation, within our parents, like my mom was born during this time, right? So how can we explain that to your healthcare workers that a lot of these implicit biases are not that old, but we need to break them?
So there are two things that are happening: denial and bright siding. That's not us, that's them. That was in the past, not the present. That's in the South, not in places like Cincinnati, right? And so, no, it's, speaking truth to ignorance, honestly. Ignorance is not an insult. It's just to say that people are unaware, and we're all unaware of something, right? So we're all guilty of being ignorant, and I don't think that's a bad thing per se, as long as you're open to knowing and learning. But no, one of the things, that really struck me in doing this work was the discovery, since I didn't know if I had time to mention this or not. I'm trying to time this out so I didn't go too long, but Cincinnati was the recipient of what was called the Shepard-Townard Grant in the 1920s, because at the time, Cincinnati had the highest infant mortality rate among big US cities, right? And this is in the 1920s. And so they applied, the state of Ohio applied for Shepard-Townard funding, and Cincinnati was designated for receiving those funds, and that money was to be used to address Black infant mortality in Cincinnati. And so for about 2 years, the program ran, and they documented a drop in infant mortality rate. Once the funding stopped, once the accountability and the oversight and the regulation stopped, those numbers rebounded. In 2022, Cincinnati has the highest infant mortality rate in Ohio, and Ohio has the second highest Black infant mortality rate in the country, behind Wisconsin, 100 years later, right? So, I struggle with knowing what the solution is, because policy and the ways that it has been administered to date has made, honestly, little difference when you look closely. Now, we can see some difference in some ways, but when we're looking at health, when we're looking at housing, I just did a talk 2 days ago at Urban Institute on some other work I've been doing on Black women and economic mobility. And one of the things that struck me there was that 1968 was the Fair Housing Act was passed. At the time, 1970, the Black home ownership rate was 42%. Guess what it is in 2022? 43%. It went up 1%. Guess what it is in Cincinnati? 33%. Right? So policing, right? Think about the United Black Front, and is it United? I think it's called the United Black Front collaborative agreement in 2002, following the death of Timothy Thomas, right? And not even 15 years later, we have another shooting of an unarmed Black man. Well, several, not just Samuel DuBose. There was one before that. But structural racism is stubborn. And it takes honest conversations about racism that we all have the potential of internalizing, irrespective of what we look like. Memphis is an example of that, right? And it takes the courage to call it out when you see it, irrespective of who's perpetrating it, right? It, you know, I try not to be pessimistic, and sometimes it's hard not to be when you see the volume of premature Black death happening around you, and you know, the disproportionality in you know, health disparities and economic and wealth building. I mean, you name it. You know, anti-Black racism in this country is real. And we need to figure out how to undo it. And it has to be deliberate. And yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable, but it just, you know, yeah.
Dr. Norwood, we have Deb Heater. She is part of our DEI team at UC Health. Go ahead, Deb.
Good morning. I'm probably going to date myself, but what I find so enlightening about this is that I have a history of investigating police shootings, which is very timely here in Cincinnati. I've also worked in social justice as a regional director for the Office of Civil Rights Commission, but I also have a great love for DEI. But I want to make a distinction carefully for someone who talked about what you're sharing, Dr. Norwood, as a history of implicit bias. We need to be very clear that there's a real distinction between overt discrimination and implicit bias. They're two sides of one very thin pancake.
Okay.
But I will say that even though one is intentional and the other one we can work on through enlightenment, the damage done by that which is intentional and that sometimes which is unintentional is just as bad.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah, of course. Yes, absolutely. 100%. I mean, a part of what's killing us slowly, I think, are, you know, these kind of microaggressions that Black people experience on a day-to-day basis. I mean, whether you go into the grocery store, you're at the red light, you're at the fast food place, you're at work, you're, you know, at the gym. It's a constant, non-stop, day to day, and it chips away at your ability to have joy and to be at peace. And so, yeah, no, it's very worrisome. But, and you think about, so, you know, the micro, and then there's the macro. Yeah, it's just, yeah, they're collectively bad. Yeah.
And if I could just one other thing and then listen to others, that's why we have to, in order to fix it, in my humble opinion, we've got to hold people accountable for that which is overt and illegal discrimination. But then we have to use our influence in the area of DEI to get people to reflect in a less judgmental way, but one that really leads us to getting allies and deploying them out into society to speak, to use their influence to speak up and advocate for people who lack influence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Bankston, I see.
I was just going to say.
Hello there, my friend. So glad to be able to sit in on this, and thank you for coming back to Cincinnati and sharing this history, some of which I've heard before. I just wanted to speak to some of what you all were just talking about. You know, one of the concepts that I began to talk about as it relates to what can we do about it when we think about what's going on today. I think there are a couple of things to consider. One is, we're not talking about that long ago. Okay, some of the things that you were talking about, I'm old enough to remember some of it. I mean, I know some of the physicians, they're still alive. Some of them, many of them aren't practicing anymore, but they are still alive and still live here locally. Some have moved, but some still live here locally. Mm-hmm. So having said that, I think that we must be mindful of the fact that, of course my phone would ring, right? We must be mindful of the fact that we're talking about the lived experiences of people, whether they're the lived experiences of the people who were operationalizing the discrimination, or they're the lived experiences of the people that were the recipient of the discrimination. Mm-hmm. And there's this, I use my graduate degree is in family counseling, and so I use this all the time as an analogy. When we think about families and we think about it from over time, there are periods of time in all of our lives where families come together and talk, right? They talk about the good times and the bad times and, what's going on in the news. I know what happened in my house growing up when I was a kid. So if we think about what might have been discussed or described across a kitchen table or a dinner table or at breakfast, if we really think about it and begin to peel back the onion, I think all of us can acknowledge that there were some things that were said in our presence that have added to who we are as people. Mm. Now, just think about that happening with everybody all over the country. And we have these Jim Crow laws. Mm-hmm. And we have the civil rights movement and all the things that have gone on over the last 50 or 60 years. Mm-hmm. And those things become a part of who we are that we pass down or pass on to. For me, was passed on. There are things that were passed on to me from my grandparents and my mom. And then I passed on some things to my kids. And now I've got grandkids. I'm sure they're talking to their kids. And those things continue to perpetuate. And I believe that some of that is the reason why we've not been able to move the needle as far as one might assume, based on the knowledge that's been given, over the course of the last few decades, because it's internal to who we are. There have been some comments in the chat about this whole notion of reverse racism. When I've been confronted with, well, it's just reverse racism, I'm like, okay, first of all, let's describe racism. Yeah. Because most of the time, people aren't really talking about reverse racism. They're talking about discrimination. Mm-hmm. They may be talking about prejudice, but they're not talking about racism. And they're not talking about it from the perspective of the system and the systematic approach to discrimination having occurred. So I agree with the people that who have been commenting that, like, just call them out, and I always ask, well, how do you describe racism? Define it, define what it is so that we could talk about what that means in reverse. Let's define what it is. Well, most often, no one's able to ever give me a definition of racism. And quite frankly, I'm old now. So I'm like, well, you all go ahead. Okay. You all go ahead, because you don't even know what you're talking about, right? You don't know what you're talking about. So I applaud you for this continuing work. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Norwood on a project, and she's just got a brilliant mind. So I applaud you for this, and for all of you all who saw it fit to come to a webinar that had Jim Crow in the title. I just applaud all of you who are here, because that to me is courageous on your part, because you will have friends or colleagues that are saying, I can't believe you went to that, right? I want you to, let's not minimize what's going on in our environment right now, what's going on in our society and in our country as it relates to these kinds of discussions. So God bless you.
I know, Karen, Dr. Bankston is just phenomenal. Wonderful. I think we could do a whole webinar with Dr. Bankston just talking.